today עם דוקטור ג'ודית הרמן. So, in a word, this was a 5-minute introduction of you in Hebrew, and Anat Gur was saying, although I'm sure everybody in the room knows, how fundamentally path-breaking important your work has been, not just in Israel, but of course everywhere around the globe, for lawyers as well as everyone else fighting to change what's been happening in courtrooms forever pretty much in this area. I'm not translating this because you know, but I will say just for the record what you also know, that Judith Lewis Herman, MD, is clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and director of training at the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts. Dr. Herman received her medical degree at Harvard Medical School and her training in general and community psychiatry at Boston University Medical Center. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Father-Daughter Incest, שיצא ב-1981, and Trauma and Recovery, זה Trauma והחלמה, מ-1992. She has lectured widely on the subject of sexual and domestic violence. She is the recipient of the 1996 Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies and the 2000 Woman and Science Award from the American Medical Women's Association. In 2007, she was named a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, and in 2011, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Trauma Psychology Division of the American Psychological Association. And once again, we're just hugely privileged to be able to have you here with us while you're still in snowy Boston. It's we have very nice weather here, so it's a shame that you can't enjoy it with us. We will give you the floor for 45 minutes or so, however long you wish, and then if we have any questions from the audience, we can have questions and answers, conversation, whatever works. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anat and Orit, and thank you all for having me. I'm sorry I can't be with you as in person, but I guess this is second best and we'll have to make do. My task today is to talk about complex trauma and to explain it for an audience that is not clinicians, but people in the legal field. And so I thought I would start with a little history. I'm going to show you 3 pictures. The first being from around the time of the French Revolution, and what was considered revolutionary then was that Dr. Pinel, an eminent psychiatrist, struck the chains off the insane in the insane asylums. And as you see, this the insane here are represented by women with the undraped bosom and the expressions, either blank expressions or expressions of horror on their faces. So from a gender politics or feminist point of view, you can say what's wrong with this picture. And here we are 100 years later, during the era of Jean-Martin Charcot in France also. This was also a revolutionary period. This was the establishment of the Third Republic, and Charcot was among the very active supporters of the revolution, and his particular contribution was to again liberate the insane, or in this case study the women who were diagnosed with so-called hysteria, and show that this was not a case of demonic possession, but that this was a psychological condition that could be at least temporarily relieved with hypnosis and also brought on with hypnosis. Here, a patient in trance is being brought into the audience to display the characteristic features of hysteria. Again, note the blank expression on the face of the patient and her undraped bosom. Again, we have one woman and surrounded by men, but I would submit to you that at this point in time, this was the only way that women could participate in scientific studies. Charcot was very revolutionary about democracy as he understood it at the time, but he was also opposed to women having medical training and certainly not the vote. So here we are 100 years later, roughly. And again, I would say it part of a revolutionary movement. And here, to our great relief, we have a group of women. They have their clothes on, they have their eyes open, they are actively participating in what Kathy Matnick, Sarah Child, called consciousness raising. She was the originator of that term, and she thought of it as a scientific method, as really a way for women to understand our political condition by sharing our stories in a safe group. And when women shared their stories in a group, what came out over and over again were stories of sexual and domestic violence, stories that women had kept secret because of their deep shame, because they had been so basically told that to reveal this secret would be to invite total ostracism and stigma. As this happened around the world, we began to not only speak but write about violence against women. And I'm just here indicating some of the initial publications that I think were influential in extending our understanding of gender-based violence. And this spread from Europe and the US, really around the world. So that by the time of the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, they were able to actually pass a resolution about violence against women, acknowledging that this was a universal obstacle to the achievement of equality and also to the objectives of development and peace. I'll show you just some prevalence studies from the US, and this I submit to you as in peacetime, in a country, in a developed country with reasonable civil society protections. If you tried to do this kind of research in a country which was experiencing civil war or any kind of disrupted government, you would certainly see even greater numbers. This was a study conducted as a random sample survey in the United States. 8,000 women and 8,000 men were randomly contacted. And these were the figures they came out with. And studies in the US have, other studies have come out basically at about 20%, or 1 woman in 5, plus or minus 5. I think another very important point that came out of the Violence Against Women survey in the US was that this sexual violence begins very early. So that if you look at the victim's age at the time of the first sexual assault, over 20% were younger than 12. And then the highest exposure was in the years of adolescence and young adulthood, so that the threat of violence is a major force that shapes the development of young women. If you make it to 25 without being raped, your chances get a little bit better of avoiding sexual assault. With that kind of prevalence of sexual assault, and we haven't even gotten into domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, it's not surprising that when it came to a lifetime prevalence survey in the United States again, a national survey looking at prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not surprising that women experience this disorder at twice the rate of men. And this is also a finding that's been replicated many times. Here's a recent study from Australia indicating that, and the y-axis here indicates odds ratios, so that, and the x-axis indicates the number of different kinds of gender-based violence that the women in this survey had been subjected to, and it was over 4,000 women who were surveyed. So if you think of not having any experience of violence as a sort of odds ratio of 1, then the prevalence of mood disorder, substance abuse, and PTSD rises exponentially with just the number of different kinds of violence that women have experienced. Sexual assault, sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, and stalking were the 4 different kinds of violence. And in particular, you see that the odds for PTSD, if you've been subjected to all these different kinds of violence, it means 25 times as great likelihood of developing PTSD. PTSD became a recognized diagnosis in the DSM-3, the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And this was really a result of the efforts of veterans of the Vietnam War. And I felt that PTSD applied reasonably well to women who had been exposed to a single incident of, say, rape or other forms of gender-based violence. But the truth is that for most victims, it's not a single incident. It's repeated over a prolonged period of time. And so when I formulated the concept of complex trauma, I took what was by then the DSM-4 a criterion, the exposure criterion, and then simply added that this exposure is repeated over a period of days, weeks, months, or years. And once you have a situation of prolonged and repeated trauma, what you realize is that you're talking about a situation of captivity, where the victim is under the control of the perpetrator and unable to escape. And that in order to understand captivity, one needs to understand the methods that perpetrators use to keep victims under their control. And it turns out that violence and the threat of violence is only one method. And as they say, as we say in the battered women's movement, a good beating is good for a year. It doesn't have to happen very often. It just has to be a credible threat. And as many battered women will say, I looked into his eyes and I realized he really could kill me. And he seemed to be a different person, and he was in a rage. And and after that, all he has to do is give her that look, and she's going to cringe. These are techniques that break down the autonomy and initiative in victims and create a defiled and degraded self-identity. After a while, the victims come to blame themselves for the situation of captivity. This is the violence wheel, which was originated with the Battered Women's Program in Duluth, Minnesota. Just out of curiosity, how many people have seen the violence wheel before? No, okay, well, I hope you have them in your handouts, because I'm not going to go into great detail about all the different methods of coercive control that are listed as spokes of the wheel, only to call your attention to the graphic that shows that the purpose of all these different methods is to establish dominance, to establish power and control. And this has been used in education not only for survivors, but also for caregivers and attorneys to try to understand the methods of the perpetrator that break down the autonomy of the victim. Because by the time the victim escapes, she's been under a condition of dictatorship, basically. And it's kind of strange to understand that conditions of dictatorship can exist even within well-established democracies, but they can. They exist in families where child abuse and domestic violence is the result. They exist in some religious cults. They exist in the sex business. And then, of course, in the more political domains that we know about, where in civil war, where child soldiers are recruited by non-state actors or state actors, and then in the political situations of enslavement and torture. I always wondered how these methods of coercive control that were, here, I'll go back for a minute, how the methods of coercive control that we know are taught by one clandestine police force to another, so that torture methods, for example, were brought over from the Nazis to the American CIA and so on, and from there to the various Latin military juntas. But how do perpetrators in families and religious cults learn these methods? And my hunch is that it's through the sex business, through the human trafficking business, because this is a business that reaches every corner of the globe. It's an enormously profitable business that it has its above ground and then criminalized aspects. This is actually not a criminalized bit of pornography. This was from Playboy a number of years ago. But if you think this is not a thing of the past, I would just suggest that you type in something like teens in chains to your computer, except really I'd do it as a thought experiment. Don't really type that into your computer, because you will never be able to get rid of the pornography. And what you have to realize is that the image of enslaved women and girls is eroticized and sexually exciting to many men around the globe. This kind of pornography and the sort of brother industry of prostitution is well established everywhere in the world. If you look at the expression on this girl's face, by the way, does it remind you of something? To me, it looks like the expressions of the women in the paintings that I showed you at the beginning of the hour. That vacant stare and that posture of cringing and shame. One of my colleagues, Rick Cluft, who wrote a wonderful paper in the 1990s on the apparent invisibility of incest, wrote about a lesson he'd gained from a pimp whom he met in his travels in Europe and got into a kind of man-to-man conversation. And he kind of asked, how do you get women for prostitution? The professional advice from the pimp was, what you really want is obedience. And how you get it is you get women who have been sexually exploited by their fathers, their uncles, their brothers, someone they love and fear and do not dare to defy, so that if you get them young within the family, you can groom them, basically, for a life of sexual exploitation. And this is something that we discover over and over again in the secrets of our patients who have been survivors of childhood abuse and neglect. So a little bit now about the psychological impact of all this coercive control. And what I proposed is that complex PTSD and this concept, which I think is a better diagnostic concept than many of the concepts that we've had out there, is what the numbing and avoidance, the intrusive imagery and nightmares, and the hyperarousal. That's the triad of simple PTSD or classic PTSD. But adding then a lot of somatic complaints, many physical illnesses and complaints, often for which no apparent medical cause can be found. Dissociation, which is something I'll explain. Extremes of emotion. These are people who are either numbed out or at the extreme of depression, anger, self-destructiveness. These are people who have a deeply shamed sense of self. Very disrupted relationships. These are people who have learned that the rules of relationship are the strong do as they please and the weak submit, and that's what they expect now of everyone. So trust has been shattered. And whatever systems of meaning they may have had before this happened to them, you see this with torture survivors a lot, is that, where was God? Concentration camp survivors, the same. And so oftentimes people lose their faith. For incest survivors, oftentimes a rejection of the faith in which they were brought up. So it's not just saying, oh, when I was a kid, I had to go to church, but now I don't go, or had to go to synagogue, whatever. It's sort of, God wasn't there for me, so I completely reject this religion, and oftentimes conversion to another religion. This is a drawing that a patient showed me early in my career. I don't think I understood what she was trying to tell me then, but I now think of this as a communicative description of what dissociation feels like. And she writes heads in the clouds. But this is a person who's cut off from what's happening in her body, and who hears no evil, sees no evil, speaks no evil. So is also cut off from the knowledge of what happened to her. And with this kind of complex PTSD, you often see memory disturbances, so that people they have only vague or screen memories of what happened to them, or very incomplete memories. Here's another drawing I got from a patient a little later in my career. This is, I think, showing you, and again, it's very graphic, so I ask your indulgence for that, but it's showing you the origin of the dissociative experience. And if you ask them, well, what happened to you? What did you do when you were being raped? And you couldn't escape, and they will say, well, I stared at the ceiling, and all of a sudden I left my body and I floated up on the ceiling, and I was watching what happened from outside my body, and I felt very sorry for that little girl, but it wasn't me. We don't understand very well the neurobiology of dissociation. We're only beginning to have some grasp of it. So I'm not going to go into the neurobiology today, other than to say that if you look at people who are dissociating or numbing out while they're recalling a traumatic memory, you'll see a kind of a brain shutdown. You don't, if you do functional MRIs, for example, you don't see much going on in the brain. There's sort of a shutdown of processing of information. But this is an area only beginning to be explored. Kids seem to do this spontaneously. It's a trance phenomenon. Of course, the staring at the crack in the ceiling, or repeating a prayer over and over, or staring at a light. These are trance induction techniques that kids learn spontaneously. With people who are political prisoners, they actually teach each other trance induction methods in order to be able to withstand torture. So I'm not going to go into much more detail about the various features of complex PTSD, except to say that the disturbances in relationship that you see with survivors are reenactments, reliving experiences in which the survivor now believes and acts as though there are only three possible positions to be in a relationship. You can be the victim, you can be the persecutor, or you can be a bystander. And as a bystander, you can either be an indifferent or even a collusive bystander, or you can be a rescuer. But there's no possibility in this, in Karpman's drama triangle, there's no possibility of mutual relationships that are mutually rewarding, mutually agreed upon. Not surprisingly, the odds of suicide or suicide attempts in people who have been subjected to this kind of violence goes way up. This is a study from called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, which, as you see, is a very large-scale study with current and over, I think, 20,000, looking at the odds ratio of suicide attempts just with different kinds of adverse childhood experiences: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and so on. I think the complex PTSD concept is useful because so many of our survivors are being misdiagnosed. Often they're diagnosed with bipolar disorder because of their emotional extremes. They're diagnosed with major depression, which they have because of their chronic suicidality, but they don't respond the way non-traumatized people do to treatments for depression. Much less satisfactory medication response. Psychotherapy is really the treatment of choice. Substance abuse and eating disorders are frequent complications. These are ways that people learn to try themselves to treat their desperately dysphoric inner state. And alcohol is a pretty, for example, or certainly opiates, are powerful medications that will get rid of PTSD symptoms temporarily, but at a terrible price. Eating disorders, I think, are can be understood partially as a way of trying to regain control of the body, even in these very extreme and distorted ways. The problem with diagnosing substance abuse and eating disorders is not that those are incorrect diagnoses. They are correct, but you don't want to stop there. You want to look below the surface and think about, well, how did this person develop an addictive disorder or an eating disorder, and really look for the trauma. Not that everyone with substance abuse and eating disorders has a trauma history. That's not the case. But trauma is a major risk factor for developing these disorders. When it comes to diagnosing personality disorder, it's really, I think, here's where you really get into kind of victim-blaming diagnoses, because both the histrionic personality disorder, which is the current version of what used to be called hysteria, or the concept of borderline personality disorder, which involves all of the above emotional extremes, chronic suicidality, relational dramas, anger, and self-injury. These have become very stigmatized diagnoses. They're very pejorative. And it's unfortunate because some patients, and particularly with borderline, will say, I do feel like I'm on the border of something all the time, on the border of being mad, basically. And, but that's not how the diagnosis is used. So I am hoping, I did want to show you one more slide. This is a study that Chris Perry, Bessel van der Kolk, and myself did back in the 1980s, where Chris was studying borderline personality disorder and comparing with subjects who had other kinds of personality disorder, narcissistic, schizotypal, or antisocial. But he gathered all kinds of information on them, but he never asked about trauma. So he allowed Bessel and me to interview his subjects blind to the diagnosis and obtain histories of childhood trauma. And Chris was astonished when he saw the numbers, the correlations that came out of his own data set, because it turned out that childhood trauma was an extremely important risk factor for developing quote-unquote borderline personality disorder, and not for the other near-neighbor diagnoses. About 85% of his subjects with borderline personality disorder turned out to have a childhood trauma history. And the worse the cumulative trauma, again, the greater the likelihood of developing borderline personality disorder. In this study, too, it was clear that early onset and long duration of the abuse was very highly correlated. Progress in recognition of the complex PTSD concept. This is a work in progress. The ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases, the current version, ICD-10, does have a diagnostic concept that's similar. It's called personality change after major traumatic exposure. And apparently in the draft for ICD-11, the current draft that's circulating, has changed that to the complex PTSD terminology, which I like better. But I gather that the ICD-11, the final draft, is not going to be done until 2015, so we won't know. But in the DSM-5, I was asked to submit a position paper in favor of recognition of complex PTSD, which I did. I hear, but I was not on the committee that is making these decisions. I hear that the complex PTSD is not going to be recognized, but that probably a dissociative subtype of PTSD will be recognized, and that could be useful. Meantime, though, the trauma professional organizations have come out or are in press with consensus treatment guidelines for complex PTSD. So this is a concept that is slowly being recognized in the trauma field. I want to finish by talking a little bit about the recovery process, because otherwise I would leave you with a very dismal picture. And in fact, one of the things that keeps me and my colleagues engaged with working with survivors and over the long haul is that people do get better and sometimes make remarkable recoveries. The antidote to coercive control is shown here in the nonviolence wheel. And that is building relationships that are based on equality for peer relationships, or for a therapeutic relationship, it's not a relationship of equality. The clinician is always in a position of greater power, but you can call it relationships of mutuality. And here are the spokes of the wheel are the components of a mutual relationship: mutual respect, fairness, shared responsibility, trust and support, honesty, and so on. And these actually are pretty good rules for a therapeutic relationship as well. Respect, voice, consent, and fairness. A study done way early by Ann Burgess and Linda Holmstrom, who coined the term rape trauma syndrome way back in the 70s. They did a follow-up study of every rape victim who came into the emergency room at Boston City Hospital, and for a year, and they followed them for 4 years, and noticed, I mean, it was a naturalistic study. Most of the survivors didn't get much treatment, but some of the survivors made remarkable recoveries on their own. And what Burgess and Holmstrom documented was that people who got better seemed to have taken action on their own behalf. And the action varied. Some people went to the police, most did not. But people got involved in some kind of action to make themselves feel more in control of their lives. And these were people who reached out to others. If they were lucky, they had supportive families or partners who said, you know, you didn't deserve this, nobody deserves this, you didn't, it's nothing you did brought this on. This was the perpetrator's decision and responsibility. But if they didn't initially encounter supportive reactions, they kept trying until they did. And finally, these were people who had made some kind of larger social meaning out of what happened to them. So these were people who said things like, I had no idea that rape was so common, and if I can do something to help one other victim or prevent this from happening to one other young woman, then it won't have been totally in vain. And so they made the atrocity that they had suffered a gift to others by getting involved in social action to try to stop the violence. And that always requires altruism, humor, the mature defenses. So we keep this in mind as we develop our treatment guidelines. This is now the the consensus of trauma experts on how you treat complex PTSD, starting with an initial focus on education so that, again, you explain to people this happens a lot, and let me explain what happens to victims so that you don't feel that you're going crazy. You're not crazy. You're suffering the extremes of reaction to being exploited and dominated, being in a relationship of coercive control. So trauma education, then addressing the symptoms, first the anxiety and sleep disturbances, the dysregulation of the body, so sleeping, eating, self-care, so dealing with self-harm, with substance abuse, and so on. And then getting into, bit by bit, strategies for being able to calm down so that you're not either numbed out or at the extremes of feeling, but somewhere in the middle, developing interpersonal skills. And only when all of that has been accomplished, focusing in on telling the trauma story. In other words, you need a safe base in the present where the person can now feel, I'm safe, this won't happen to me now, I'm with people who respect me and who care about me and who don't want to control and exploit me. And once people have that secure feeling, then it's possible to go back to the past and say, this happened to me, and go back and visit the trauma in detail with feeling, because at the same time one has an anchor in the present, so that the person knows this isn't happening now. And as the trauma memory is processed, then the grieving of what was lost, because one can never go back to the quote-unquote innocent person one was before this happened. And then making new meaning, as Burgess and Holmstrom found, oftentimes in social action, sometimes a new religious meaning, but something that means it's that creates for the survivor a sense that life is more than just being an exploiter, a perpetrator, or a victim. For reasons that may be obvious to you now, group treatment, I think, is very much a treatment of choice for survivors. This is a very nice quote I have from Bernard Williams, the British philosopher, the late Bernard Williams, talking about how people have both a sense of their own honor and a respect for other people's honor, so that we feel indignation when we see another person's honor violated. And those shared sentiments bind a group together. It's very important for survivors to have a sense of belonging rather than ostracism. Oftentimes that means a survivor group with people who have been there, done that in similar circumstances. So this is this is a outline for a self-defense and self-esteem women's group organized by a New York group called Girls Educational and Mentoring Services, and this is for young women who've been in the sex trade. Similarly, veterans often need to be in a group with other veterans, because civilians just haven't been there, don't understand what it's like. That might be less true, I would say, in Israel than many other places. Just a little plug, I can't resist, for a book that my colleagues and I brought out in 2011. This is just a guide for practitioners who want to implement a particular kind of group that we have developed for survivors. And this can be adapted to many different populations. This is a quote from somebody in a group, in one of our groups. She says, "The biggest things for me are the benefits of not keeping a secret." I love this quote. I thought if I talked about these things, people would go scurrying from the room like rats. And it didn't happen. And now you see the development of self-compassion. Oftentimes what we find in these groups is that the group members are very compassionate toward one another. They feel outrage on behalf of others who have been victimized. They don't feel compassion toward themselves. And when they're challenged about that, they will say, well, no, in my circumstance, you see, it was different. And they set themselves apart. And the group will challenge that gently and say, no, it's not different. And you aren't apart. You belong in this group. And you take in the caring and the compassion that is being sent your way by other people? Can you allow that to come in? And when the person is able to do that, it's an incredibly moving experience to witness. And I think it is a very moving and transformative experience for survivors, where they really do come to have compassion for themselves. The small therapeutic group is also a kind of healing that takes place in sharing in public and in being part of social action. And so I'm just showing you a poster for Take Back the Night, which is a demonstration against violence against women that has become customary every year in the U.S. Are there Take Back the Night demonstrations in Israel? Has anybody ever participated in one? No, I've not seen that. Well,
The answer is yes.
The Tel Aviv Rape Crisis Center does that.
Actually, a lot of people were saying yes.
Yes. Oh, okay, good. That's right. I forgot that. I couldn't understand.
And there is a reminder here that the first time this took place here was 1979, and there are lots of people here who say they participate in this on behalf, together with this rape crisis center. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I just want to close talking about the ways in which we've gone in the women's movement from those early consciousness-raising groups through then the development of alternative institutions, the rape crisis centers, the battered women's shelters, the hotlines. In Somerville, where I worked at the time, the battered women's shelter was developed by community women who initially it was an underground network where they didn't have a safe house, but women who were part of the network would put a light on their porches when they were able to receive fugitives. and women would flee to their neighbors' houses. So we went through that, and then slowly the education of professionals and of the legal profession, the medical profession, and so on. That's I've highlighted because that's, I feel, where I've done most of my work, is in trying to basically educate professionals, although my writing, I try to write in such a way that the writing is also available to general readers. But the audience I have thought of primarily is the professional audience, trying to really create an entire shift in understanding of what happens to survivors of gender-based violence. And then we moved to training the police, to getting legal reforms such as restraining orders, a little bit about restitution, which in our country I think was facilitated by probably the only progressive piece of legislation to come out of the Reagan years. This was called the Victims of Crime Act, and what it did was set up a trust fund financed by fines on criminal offenders. And the trust fund is used to make restitution to victims. So individual victims can apply for restitution for medical bills or lost work, days of work lost as the result of being victimized. But also the monies from VOCA have been used to fund battered women's shelters, rape crisis centers, and programs such as ours, the Victims of Violence program at Cambridge Hospital. So I mention that to you as a wonderful model, I think, of making perpetrators as a group make restitution to victims as a group. So I'll close on the occasion of International Women's Day with a quote from Yakin Ertürk, who was the last special rapporteur on violence against women. And then I think at the end of her tenure, this was part of her report. I thought it was amazing to think back and think, well, now we have an actual special rapporteur at the United Nations that talks about violence against women and travels around the world to report on the condition of women in gender-based violence in different countries. She talks about, she says it's now firmly acknowledged around the world that violence against women is not inevitable, it cannot be justified or excused by any means, and it has given hope to women around the world that this pandemic can and must be stopped. So I leave you with that thought, which gives me hope as well, and thank you all once again for your attention.
So on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much for this very touching and inspiring talk. And Roni, would you like to start?
I'm sorry about my English. It's not so good like my Hebrew. I wanted to thank you personally. I'm a victim of incest in my family. I was hurt from the age of 3 until 12. my sister well as well, and it took me lots of years, maybe until I was 38. It was the first time I talked about being a sexual victim, and only when I was 40, when I had my second child, my second boy, I got as a present your book. 5 years ago, I got your book, Trauma and Recovering, and for me it was a saving. It opened for me a new page in my life. I decided as a lawyer, as a new lawyer, to stop dealing with all the boring stuff of lawyers, and I opened in my house a private firm only for victims of sexual crimes. And I remember the day that when I read your book and I got to the middle of it, and I was astonished to see this white page that is written on it, recovering. I never thought that I can be recovered from my past. Thank you.
Thank you so
I
much.
hope you remember that Roni is the lawyer who organized this evening, and she heads the Committee for Women's Rights in the Israeli Lawyers Bar. So it was her initiative, and very important to her that you be our speaker tonight.
Oh, I'm just so moved by your courage and your eloquence in speaking out. So thank you very much for sharing that.
So we'll open the floor for some questions. And since I don't see anyone rising to the challenge,
Ori, I should also, Ori, I also should say that because we got started late, I can only stay for another 5 minutes.
Okay. So I do see 2 hands up, 3 hands up. I'll take the questions. Maybe we'll gather the questions. Is that okay? We gather them, and then you can choose how to answer them.
Okay.
I wanted to know what...
I don't think... Okay.
Hi, good morning. I wanted to know what your opinion about using dissociation as a tool or as one tool for treating of sexual victims, of therapy to sexual victims.
Okay. Yifat, was it you at the back there?
Hello, Judith. I want to thank you very much for your inspiring work. We were just able recently in the court to win a preliminary argument for statute of limitation using the notion of repressed memories and dissociations in women who were victims of incest. So I wanted to ask you, is there some kind of clear distinction between these two notions of dissociation and repressed memories? Like what exactly, if you can, give me some brief about what exactly the difference is, or if not exactly, generally speaking. Thank you.
There was one more.
אולי אני אדבר בעברית ואת תתרגמי אותי.
How good is your Hebrew? That's okay. I'll translate.
יש לי חזון, שמי קרן לוי, ויש לי חזון שבעוד 20 או 30 שנה אין יותר פגיעה מינית, בטח לא בילדים. ואני פועלת בכל דרך שאני מכירה בשביל לעשות את זה, כולל 2 קדנציות רצופות בהנהלה של מרכז סיוע לנשים נפגעות תקיפה מינית, כולל הקמה בשותפות עם עורך דין רוני אלוני של פרויקט מגע, והגענו לכנסת ומקומות נוספים. אני רוצה לשאול אותך, פרופסור הרמן, יש לי את המחשבה אם אנחנו נצליח להפחית בושה ואשמה מנפגעות גילוי עריות, אז בעצם נצליח לפוגג את נשארתי בלי מילים. נצליח לפוגג בעצם את המערך החברתי שתומך בסוד, בשמירת הסוד. והדבר שאת אמרת בעצם הוא שהדרך שאת פעלת היה לחנך אנשי מקצוע. אני שואלת מה דעתך על לחנך הורים ובמיוחד אמהות לשאול את הילדים שלהם ולאפשר פתח.
Okay, I'm going to make it shorter because we have this time limit. Karen Levy said that her vision is to see the end of child sexual abuse. She's hoping in a few decades, and she's dedicated her life to it, and she spends her life doing projects, some of them with Roni Aloni, and at the Sexual Victims Crisis Center. And she actually asked two questions. One was she feels that the shame and the guilt that victims feel are the basis for the source of power that their abusers still enjoy. And do you agree with that? And do you feel that this is something major to address?
Sure.
And the other is, she said you referred to professionals. And how do you feel about teaching and educating parents and
mothers,
especially mothers in the families? So we had three questions from the audience. I will add a short one just because we're lawyers here. And could you say anything about consent? Since this is something that I often run up against with Anat, for instance, when we go to the Knesset, we're invited to talk about legislation, say, against child abuse and things like that, or prostitution, and then there will always be a young woman to say, I consent to everything that's now being done to me. I want it. Your feminist attitude is patronizing. It's paternalistic. Get out of my life. So as a lawyer, I'm stuck with, having to treat someone as an agent, as a subject. Is there anything you could say about consent that could be useful to us lawyers?
Okay. Let me see if the easiest one to answer was the question about is shame and part of the mechanism of keeping victims under coercive control, and I think it's the major, or one of the major ways that perpetrators establish dominance over their victims. Regarding the question of repressed memory versus dissociation, I think dissociation is just simply the more accurate term. Repressed memory now has a kind of has been adopted by the popular media and so on, but it's not, as far as we can tell, what the memories are dissociated in the sense that they're not stored or retrieved in normal fashion. They're certainly encoded, they're there, but they aren't. If you do the kind of search of your memory that you do to say, you're when you graduated from law school or some other event, you bring that up out of your memory when you want it and you put it away when you don't want it. Dissociated memories are not subject to that kind of access. Using dissociation as a therapeutic technique, I'm not sure exactly what was meant by that, but it's not something that we recommend in terms of, say, I think there's a way, certainly with dissociative subjects, that since they already understand how to get into trance, you can use that for some positive self-soothing capabilities. But in general, dissociation seems like a kind of a lifesaver for people in the moment when they can't escape. But people pay a very high price for being at the mercy of their dissociative states. And so we really, the focus of treatment is really on having an integrated person where dissociated feelings and memories and so on are accessible in a normal state of consciousness. And finally, the tough question about consent in the sex trade. I mean, with underage women, I think the issue is the age of consent, I think, because for most women who are being used in prostitution, the average entry into the sex trade is at age 13. At least that's true in this country. And I imagine it's true elsewhere as well. But certainly in adolescence, below the age of consent. So for most women in prostitution, they have been groomed to this life from day one. There are, this is most, but not all. There are adult women who are generally in business for themselves, don't have a pimp, keep their money, feel like they are at the high end of the sex trade. They feel that they entered it voluntarily and can leave voluntarily. They're not drug addicted, which would certainly, if they are, then there's a diminished capacity argument. But there are people who enter the sex trade voluntarily, but they are so unrepresentative of the majority that, yeah, they can have a voice in making policy, but it's a very, very unusual and minority position, and that needs to be established. I'm not sure that's helpful, but that's what I can think of off the top of my head. Once again, thank you all for your attention. I feel honored to have been part of your conference.
Thank you very much for your patience with us and for waiting for us. And it was well worth waiting for you. And thank you very much for agreeing to be with us. We felt you were here, even though you have to go out into the snow again, far away from us. Thanks. כדאי שתכבד.